Okay, so thanks for joining me again on our series. I hope you enjoyed the first two parts. If you haven't had a chance to check out those parts, I recommend you do those at some point. So it'll make the story, give it a lot more context, and it is a story, it's told over several weeks. So highly recommend that. But the parts of the story of the Iberian crypto Jews we'll talk about today is I call it part 3, the journey to Alhambra. And the reason for that will be made clear as we go along. So far in the story, I've just summarized it here in one slide. So our first week, I sort of reviewed the various possibilities of when the Sfaradim arrived in Spain, ranging from possibilities such as the Roman Empire, including sort of further back into the Second Temple period, the First Exile, even the First Temple period. Last week, which was part 2, we talked about the golden age of Spanish Jewry, of Sephardic Jewry, which was when the conditions were quite favorable, and also I believe there was divine blessing allowing the Jews to flourish for many centuries, succeeding in science, in medicine, in poetry, business, diplomacy, and also religious texts and the religious study as well. And the community became very wealthy and quite multicultural for the era. So again, that was a really, I guess, uplifting sort of time where we can sort of reflect on good times in our history. This week's going to be a much more depressing week. We're going to be reviewing the rest of Sephardic Jewish history until 1492, which is not a very good period. It's the period when conditions were getting worse and worse for the Jewish people in Spain and in Portugal as well. So this is part 3 of 6 of the presentations I'm planning to give on the story of the Iberian crypto Jews. This is the last one, which I'm going to be talking about sort of Iberia itself. So the rest, and also on the Sfaradim specifically, the following weeks after that, I'm mainly going to be talking about the crypto Jews, the hidden Jews, which were there in Spain, in Portugal, in the colonies after the expulsion. So we'll continue on now. The quick side note, just to remind you guys that there's no references on the PowerPoint. They will be available at some stage when I get the written account out. Just a quick reminder. We'll move on. So I want to remind us of an important note before we begin the actual story about the exile. So the Jews in exile were destined to endure an uncertain experience. While they were enjoying some success, overall it would be a harsh experience. So we're reminded of this from Lamentations chapter 1, verse 3. It says, Judah has gone into exile because of affliction and hard servitude. She dwells now among the nations, but finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. So it's important to note here, it's not just talking about spiritual yearning, it's talking also about the physical. So the land of Israel was not only a place of spiritual satisfaction for the Jewish people, it was also a place of physical blessing. So of sort of plenty of food, of security, of shelter, of prosperity and identity as a people. So the exile was also not supposed to only remind the Jews of their spiritual lack, but also their physical lack as well. So it was designed by God to be a harsh experience overall for the Jewish people, unfortunately. And the situation would not completely resolve until the Messiah comes. And we read this prophecy from Isaiah chapter 11. I'm just going to quote a couple of verses from verse 1 and verse 12. So verse 1 is, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, obviously a messianic term, and the branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And I'll skip until verse 12. He will raise a signal for the nations and will assemble the banished of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. So even though we do have the state of Israel today, the job of full restoration is seen as a job fire. As in, even today, there are still a majority of Jews which are exiled from the land. So, the full restoration of Israel is prophesied in the Tanakh to come in Messianic era. So just important notes to remember. Now, I'll get back to the narrative and just talk about the state of Spanish Jewry, of Sephardic Jewry at the end of the Golden Age. So important to note, the decline was insidious. And what do we mean by the decline? Essentially, it was a gradual reduction of freedoms and of rights, which first affected the Jews economically, but then shifted to religious rights, and then which was increased pressure to convert. And freedom of movement, Jews were more confined to their distinct areas, called Juderias in Spain. And also their social rights were also infringed upon. They were not allowed to associate with Christians, and also even personal safety. There was lots of deadly riots which occurred towards the end of this period, and we would call them pogroms today. The 1200s or the 13th century was definitely the last sort of century of the Golden Age, whatever definition we want to use. That's when the major shift occurred. It was either sort of like the last of the good times or the first of the bad times. Still, it's a bit blurry. So that's what I mean to say the decline didn't occur all at once. So even though the Christian rule was established by the 13th century, it didn't necessarily bring the decline. So a lot of people sort of simplistically points to Christianity as being the reason before the decline. It's not really true. By the time the 11 and 1200s came around, most of Iberia was reconquered by the Christian armies. But actually, there was a principle called convivencia. I think I'm saying it right. And that was essentially an attempt of peaceful coexistence between Jews and Christians mainly. And that was motivated by the Christian need for allies in the Reconquista. So they were worried that if they didn't have enough allies, if the Jews allied themselves with the Muslims again, and at the time there was disillusionment with the Muslim rule by the Jews because they were starting to become more extreme again. They were worried that if the Jews realigned themselves with the Muslims, then they would join forces and push the Christians back again. So they needed the Jews as allies in their fight against the Muslims, and the Jews definitely obliged. So it wasn't really genuine tolerance that we know of today. It was more sort of a practical tolerance. But there was a relative period of coexistence between Jews and Christians. And what we'll do now for the rest of the talk today is we'll review the major events which either hallmarked or precipitated the decline. So the first thing that's important to note is this event. It's a very, very important event in Jewish history in Spain, the 1263 Disputation of Barcelona. So I briefly mentioned this last week when we were talking about the Ramban, and this is a pivotal moment for several reasons. But first, we need to talk about what the disputations actually were. What were disputations? So there was a theoretical aspect and there was a practical aspect. The theoretical aspect was there was supposed to be religious debates, they were supposed to be fair, and they were supposed to flesh out the differences in doctrine between the faiths for better learning and understanding. It's similar to what a religious debate would be today. However, in practice, they were really political tools. They were political tools used to pressure conversions. And they were not at all fair. They were always accompanied by elements of coercion. Being forced to take part in the debate in the first place, Jews often didn't want to debate. Jews were being forced to listen, so they often forced Jews in the town to actually gather, even if they didn't want to go. And there was often an accompanying crowd or a rabble threatening violence if conversions didn't happen. The atmosphere intimidation and hostility, so there were not atmospheres of freedom and of learning, really. And Jewish participants were also never actually allowed to debate properly. They were almost never given freedom of speech, which obviously greatly impedes their ability to argue. Even if they had freedom of speech, though, they often wouldn't use it properly because they were intimidated by the Christian crowd. So there was always a violence. So again, not really a very pleasant situation for the Jews. And I'll give you an example. In France, actually, while Spain was still having its golden age, France was having several disputations, and they were always accompanied by violence and forced conversions. And that's devastated Jewish communities in France. So it never ended well for the Jewish people to have these debates. And I guess even just from a modern perspective, I think these are some of the reasons why Jews sort of try and avoid religious debates today and avoid debates with Christians, all because of these sort of memories. So that's an important historical contextual tool. Until now, until the 13th century, the Jews of Spain had been relatively spared by these terrible events. But what was happening is, towards the end of the 13th century and the 14th century, even some of the monarchs who actually were quite tolerant of the Jews actually wanted to get conversions. So it was seen as something like similar to a political victory today. So if you can think of a political victory, today would be, I don't know, reducing the deficit or saving people's lives from coronavirus. And in those days, a huge political victory would be to convince Jews to convert. So it's seen as a popular, a way to make yourself popular with the people was to get people to convert. So that's probably what prompted this debate. And we'll continue to the next slide. At this debate, again, I won't be able to discuss the full details of this debate, but essentially the Ramban, the great Maimonides, was compelled. Underline that word compelled. He didn't want to. He was compelled to debate a Jewish convert to Christianity. His name was Pablo Cristiani. And actually, it was actually one of the most fair. It was actually one of the fairest disputations on the record, because he actually was given freedom of speech. And he actually used the freedom of speech quite well. And his responses to Christianity's questions actually greatly impressed the king. The king was King James I of Aragon. And even though it actually impressed the king, it also greatly embarrassed the Dominican order of the church. So basically, they were the ones who sanctioned the debate to get conversions. And because the Ramban answered so well, they were actually greatly embarrassed. Unfortunately, when the Ramban tried to publish a written account, he was actually exiled as punishment. So it was a mock trial which essentially resulted in his exile, and he was punished for a debate that he didn't even want to participate in. And he hadn't really done anything wrong. He was just publishing an account of the debate. So that was, I guess, could be a sign of the sort of growing intolerance towards the Jews in Spain. It wasn't outright intolerance right now, but there was definitely less patience for the Jewish position, for sure. So this is probably one of the turning points of this sort of history of the Jews in Spain. Instead of like the Jews seen as equal to Christians, they were definitely seen as like beneath Christians, and there was a massive appetite for conversions, whatever the price. And however, this debate actually didn't really, this disputation didn't really produce many converts, fortunately, but the next event in our timeline certainly did. The Jewish community was protected from violence, mainly because of the king, but the flames of popular discontent were definitely being fanned. So I'll skip about 130 years now to the summer of 1391. That was a truly horrible few months for the Sephardic Jews. It was preceded by decades of rising anti-Jewish sentiment. Anti-Jewish polemics were increasing, mainly fed by the preaching of lay clergy. Funny enough, the hierarchy, the really high officials of the church tried to actually stop this sort of preaching. They didn't want violence necessarily being propagated in the name of Jesus, but the lay clergy had no problem with sort of giving very inflammatory messages. One particularly damaging preacher was a guy called Ferran Martinez. And he's been quoted as calling the Jews idolaters and calling synagogues houses of the devil, really horrible things, encouraging his listeners to oppress the Jews as much as possible. And actually, the higher-ranking church officials tried to actually muzzle him a bit, to silence him, because he was so inflammatory, especially because they were worried about social security and stability of the kingdom. But essentially, he was so popular, this guy, that they were unsuccessful. And he was very popular with the peasants, the poor people, because he apparently was very charitable and quite a pious guy amongst them. So he was quite popular amongst the people, unfortunately. And essentially, the sort of rising anti-Jewish sentiment boiled over eventually in 1391. And that summer, so the Northern Hemisphere summer, our winter, June to September, were really terrible months for the Jewish communities. The first violence started in Seville in Andalusia, eventually spread throughout Spain, and maybe 50,000 people are estimated to have been directly killed throughout the summer. So a lot of people were killed, and many communities were burnt and destroyed and vanished forever. Many actually great communities were completely destroyed in Spain because of this. So really tragic time for the Jewish community in Spain as a whole. And also, as a consequence of this, there were many conversions to Christianity. About 150,000 Jews estimated converted to Christianity at this time. And that was actually about half of Spain's Jews. So a huge amount of people converted to Christianity, and it changed the framework of the community forever. Now, there were mostly forced conversions. Now, the topic of anusim comes to mind, the concept of anusim. Anusim is an interesting concept. I'll talk more about anusim maybe next week, but essentially anusim means forced ones. But the connotation of anusim is the concept of severe forcing. It's stronger than the English word. So the Hebrew word la'anot means like literally to force, but also means to rape as well. So it's a very strong, forceful connotation in a sense that they really had no other choice. Of course, the sincerity of these converts was questionable because they were forced to. So many of them still attempted to practice Judaism, even though they were baptized Christians. And that's when we sort of get into our sort of concept of crypto-Judaism or hidden Judaism, as we sort of know it today. And I'll be talking much more about this in the coming weeks. But anyway, Judaism was not yet dead in Spain. There were great leaders who tried to revitalize the Jewish community, such as Chasdai Crescas. They actually attempted to bring the crypto-Jews back into the fold and actually supported them in the observance of Judaism, which is interesting because if you think about the situation today in Jewish mission, we have obviously the Messianic Jews like myself who believe in Jesus and have been baptized or mikvahd into believing, probably outnumbered non-converted Jews. From a practical point of view, if the community outnumbers you, you have to try and incorporate them into your community. That's number one. Number two, family ties were often stronger than religious ties. So crypto Jews, or sort of conversos, the converts, were still going through the family cycle, like weddings, funerals, bar mitzvahs, holidays. They were still going through the Jewish cycle, and they were often family events. And the family ties were actually quite strong. So conversos or crypto Jews actually celebrated a lot of these things in a Jewish way. Now, crypto Jews themselves were actually ostracized from wider society because a lot of the old Christians didn't trust them because they didn't trust their sincerity. Well, that makes sense if they were forced to convert. So I'm not sure what the surprise was. But anyway, they were not trusted by wider society. And it actually forced them to sort of associate more with their Jewish neighbors because assimilation was quite difficult in that era. And also the approach of Maimonides, which probably had the biggest influence. So Maimonides himself was actually forced out of southern Spain by Muslim extremism. And I don't think he converted, but I think some members of his family feigned conversion to try and secure safe passage out of Spain. And his opinion was that a Jew who was forced to convert, was not valid. So a conversion under duress was not valid because obviously it was forced, as long as the person returned to Judaism at the earliest opportunity. And so essentially, the rabbis of the day took this approach quite seriously, and they basically said that as long as a Jew tried their best to return to Judaism as soon as possible, they couldn't be held accountable for the conversion. So that's, I think, greatly influenced how the Jewish community treated these Jews. From the church's point of view, they saw the conversions as valid. So the church didn't actually condone the violence, they condemned the violence. They didn't want violent conversions, but they saw once you were baptized, unless you were physically dragged to baptism, which Jews were not physically dragged to baptism, they were sort of threatened with things if they didn't convert. They saw that as being valid conversion. So to the church, any practice of Judaism by these converts was considered heresy. So again, a difference in perspectives, which sort of caused a lot of pain for the Jewish people, because this leads into our next discussion about the Inquisition. But before we get to the Inquisition, we'll talk about another disputation, which was held in Tortosa in 1413 to 1414. That was an almost 2-year disputation. I think there were about roughly 62 sessions, something like that. I can't remember exactly how many. A Jewish convert also initiated the debate. It was a guy called Geronimo de Santa Fe. Now, compared to the 1263 disputation, the situation for the Jews was far worse. And what I mean by that, Jews were not given freedom of speech and had to avoid phrases which would offend the church. Obviously, how are you supposed to argue for your side if you can't offend the church? Because obviously the opposite opinion would offend them. The Jewish community was also still frightened by the 1391 massacres. And also they learned how easily the population could be fanned into anti-Jewish violence. So there were more reserves than they would have been held before that. And also general hostility was far higher in the 15th century than it was in the 13th century. And actually, the church officials actually openly admitted to the biased nature of these debates. So the anti-pope was a competitor to the pope, but basically the highest official who was overseeing the disputation. He actually openly admitted that it was completely biased. So he actually said the following: "You scholars of the Jews should know that I have not come here and I have not sent for you in order to prove which of our two religions is true. For it is a known thing with me that my religion and faith is true, and that your Torah was once true but has been abolished. You have only come because Geronimo has said that he will prove from the Talmud of your rabbis which knew more than you do, that the Messiah has come. So again, there was a massive agenda here, which did not bode well for the Jewish people. We'll move to the next slide. Now, of course, the Jewish side, instead of being sort of a single strong rabbi, they were actually a coalition of scholars. They were a great coalition in their own right, but they were isolated from their families, they were isolated from the communities, and also from their financial resources for the duration of the disputation for almost 2 years, and that greatly weakened their resolve and endurance. Now, the Christian side actually was quite sophisticated. They were led by a very sophisticated scholar, Geronimo de Santa Fe. He had previously studied with rabbis. He was quite educated and quite sophisticated, and he actually gave good arguments. Actually, some of the Jewish observers actually criticized the weakness of the Jewish arguments in comparison to the Christian ones, which is, I guess, obviously a bit harsh given they had difficult circumstances. But the Jewish intellectual argument was much weaker compared to before. There was no like great Ramban to sort of rescue the argument, unfortunately. And also, the whole event was quite extravagant. It was accompanied by a lot of flair, a lot of pomp. Hundreds of people, perhaps thousands, were actually watching, including Jews who were forced to watch, and also many Christians. And obviously, Jews were harassed constantly and worried about violence. So there was a huge atmosphere of intimidation, of threat, and the authorities this time were less inclined to protect the Jews because the Reconquista was almost finished. So there was not a real incentive for them to protect the Jews anymore, unfortunately. And what happened as a result? Look, the main legacy was not violence. There were outbreaks of violence, but large amounts of Jews did not die, thank goodness. But unfortunately, there was a great drop in morale. That was really the main result of this disputation. And it was not helped by the atmosphere of hostility, but also there were numbers of high-profile conversions. One of the main Jewish speakers for the Jewish side of the debate, his name was Don Vidal Ben Beniste. He was actually one of the ones who converted. So imagine the discouragement to the Jewish people when one of your great speakers, one of your great leaders was the ones to convert. So again, these circumstances were so demoralizing to the Jewish people that tens of thousands more converted. Of course, it's much easier to resist the persecution if you believe in the cause, but if you see your own leaders weakening their resistance and converting, it's much harder to resist. So a lot of Jews just sort of gave up and converted. And the time in the 15th century was a time of great change in the monarchy. There was a lot of change in terms of the priorities. So when the Reconquista was in doubt, tolerance was required for the Jews. But then as the 15th century rolled around and then the Reconquista was more secure, homogeneity was considered more important. So the monarchy felt that they had to protect their new minorities and protect their new converts. And they actually attempted to distance themselves from the unconverted Jewish population. So actually the monarchy attempted to do that for them. And this attempted to weaken the resolve of the Jewish community to resist as well. And this was especially true when Castile and Aragon were united under the reign of Isabella and Ferdinand, respectively, towards the end of the 15th century. And unfortunately, the Jews had to lead increasingly pressured and restricted lives. For example, restricted to living in their Jewish districts in sort of ghetto called juderias, restricted in what occupations they can do. They were not allowed to be doctors and not allowed to sell certain items. Had to wear identifying clothing, had to adhere to a curfew. Conversos, the ones who were converted, were forced to attend church and had to hear sermons to consolidate faith in Christianity. And conversos and Jews were not allowed to associate with each other. All these things were designed to do two things: to isolate the Jews and also to consolidate the conversos in Christianity. Now, the Inquisition came along, and the reason it came along because despite all those other measures, the conversos were actually not very successful in Christianizing. They were still relatively they practiced a lot of Judaism still, and they're still associated with the Jewish population. Hence, the monarchy was asking permission for an Inquisition. So in those days, you had to ask the Pope for permission to actually investigate heresy, and the Pope did give permission in 1478 to conduct the Inquisition, which basically was a tribunal to sort of find and correct heresy and hence consolidate homogeneity of faith in Spain. it actually lasted for 356 years until 1834. So a huge, huge institution for centuries. So theoretically, the Inquisition was a tribunal to read out heresy. And what they would do is they would go to a place where they thought heresy was happening and read something called an edict of grace. I can't really talk about the process in much detail, but essentially it gave sort of heretics usually 30 to 40 days to admit their guilt. And if they were able to admit their guilt and repent, then they would be given a punishment or a minor punishment. Now, if they were found out to be a heretic after the edict had expired, punishments were much harsher. Now, in terms of how the Inquisition found heretics, the Inquisition would have their own spies, but mostly they relied on volunteers. Local volunteers were very keen to help the Inquisition, so that's who they relied on. And as a theoretical safety net, the accused were allowed to spike their enemies, and if the enemies were the ones who gave any evidence, that was discarded. So that was a theoretical process. Unfortunately, the practical outworkings of this were much worse. So it was as much a political tool as it was a religious tool, unfortunately. Heretics were actually, they were fined, and also if they were convicted, the whole property was confiscated. Obviously, that was a massive incentive to conduct trials. If the government needed more money or the church needed more money at the time, they could just do more trials. So it's sort of a perverse incentive to find heresy. Now, heretics were held in prison, sometimes for years, and again, often in solitary confinement. A really, really awful situation for them. Humiliation, torture, and abuse were all parts of the process. Torture was used officially by the Inquisition to extract confessions. However, the worst punishment was if they were handed over to the secular authorities, because secular authorities were actually used torture much more and much more gruesome forms of torture. And if that didn't work, then they were sort of paraded around in a humiliating garment called San Benito, which was a smock with a cross on it. It was seen as a humiliation. And the worst punishment was something called an auto da fe, which was literally means an act of faith, which essentially was a big ceremony where Jews were burnt alive at the stake. So really, really horrible persecutions. Now, the Inquisition was supposed to target all types of heresy, but conversos were definitely disproportionately targeted. And an unstated goal of the Inquisition was to crush crypto-Judaism, specifically. And it means they were heavily monitored, heavily scrutinized. There was an atmosphere of great fear and mistrust. People could not, trust each other, because it came to the point where even a mere, even like a vestigial custom, something that was observed out of habit without any understanding, was enough to convict someone. For example, let's say your family lit candles on Friday night. Now, many crypto-Jewish families lit candles on Friday night, but, many people didn't know why. They weren't actually doing it to observe the Jewish Sabbath, but then they just did it out of habit. But that was enough to harbor suspicion. Even washing your clothes on the wrong day was enough to harbor suspicion, because what if you're doing it for a Jewish festival? Again, really quite disastrous. People could not trust each other at all. And however, what people did to try and combat this was they tried to sort of say to the church that, I'm not really a convert. So the Inquisition only had jurisdiction over converts, over Catholics, not over Christians, not over Jews. So all theoretically someone has to do was to say, I was never a Catholic, I was never a Christian, I was always a Jew. And theoretically they didn't have enough things to go off. So that was theoretically. So in the next slides, I'll just show a few pictures here. So the picture on the left is basically an Inquisition trial. You can see there's the people in the dunce caps and in the smocks. That was the San Benito. And you can see them sort of bowing their heads in humiliation. Really, it was supposed to embarrass them and humiliate them. The one on the right is a form of torture that they used. It was a form of torture where they tied their hands and their feet behind their heads, and they would stretch them upon the wheel until the pain would be too severe, that they would obviously be forced to say whatever the church wants to hear. So that was one of the most common types of torture. Another type of torture they used was to simulate drowning, where they would basically flood the person's throat and nose with water to make them feel like they were drowning, as a form of torture as well. And actually wasn't the worst thing. The burning of the stake was actually the worst thing that they did. And this is an illustration of that. So burning of the stake alive, usually. So really quite horrendous punishments that they had in those days. Now, we'll talk about quickly, before we finish, the role of the church. So The church is criticized for this event. I think rightly criticized. However, I do think we need to put it into context, because I do think we get the wrong idea of exactly what the church did. So, first of all, some people quote humongous numbers of deaths, like millions of deaths, which is definitely not true, especially when you look at modern scholarship. Modern numbers are less than 30,000, and perhaps as few as 2 or 3,000. Of course, a few thousand people over 350 years is a far different picture than millions of deaths. And also must be understood that from the church's point of view, syncretism and spectrums of faith were unknown. You were either Jewish or Christian. Now, adopting elements from both was virtually unheard of, and it was seen as a threat. So Messianic Judaism, for example, in its current form, would not be possible in the Middle Ages. People did not see it as possible to mix the two. And heresy was seen as a much more grave threat to society than today. It was seen as not only a religious and spiritual sin, but also as a threat to society. So this is in an era when church and state were pretty much the same. They were interwoven. And it was sort of seen as a way to weaken society from within itself, cause division within society. So if you think about how terrorism would be considered today, like Islamic extremism, it was that sort of idea of heresy in those days. So if you think about that, the decision to try and weed it out actually doesn't seem so harsh in that circumstance. Of course, you can say the church shouldn't have had this in the first place, but the church actually tried to stop the Inquisition at some points. In the 1480s, the Pope thought it was too cruel and there was a lack of due process, so they actually tried to stop the Inquisition, but the monarchy in Spain didn't want to stop because it was very useful to them politically. So they compromised by having a Grand Inquisitor to basically regulate the process. So again, the church's role is a bit complex. But despite all these measures, crypto-Judaism still continued to thrive, unfortunately. And the monarchy was the one who eventually decided to expel the Jews, but the monarchy was not especially anti-Semitic. They were not anti-Semitic in the way that we would think of today. They did not hate the Jews to the core, but essentially they were convinced by the Grand Inquisitor Thomas of Torquemada that the only way to finally achieve the victory that they wanted, and the victory that they wanted was the united, strong, prosperous Spain, was to expel the Jews. Because despite all the different measures, crypto-Judaism continued to thrive. And at the final defeat of the Moors at Granada in 1492 was the time when the church and the monarchy finally saw the Jews as being completely expendable. And that was why it happened in 1492, the expulsion, because that was when the Christians finally defeated the Muslims. Now, the place where the edict of expulsion was signed into law was in Granada, at a place called Alhambra, which is located in the Kingdom of Granada. It was signed into law on the 31st of March, 1492. And basically, in summary, it accused the Jews of conspiring to corrupt the faith of conversos, and hence being a threat to Spain. It gave them 4 months to leave, to convert, or to essentially face execution. And the last day of this was the 31st of July, 1492, which is Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Ab, when when lots of great catastrophes happened towards the Jews in those days. For example, the temple was destroyed. Now, obviously, the Muslims were also eventually expelled, but it took longer. I think in Castile, it was outlawed in 1502. Now, the Alhambra Decree was obviously fought by the Jewish leaders. They led one final resistance, though they pleaded with the monarchy. Even tried to bribe them with a large bribe. However, the edict still stood. It didn't manage to convince them. And unfortunately, as a result of this decree, the Jewish presence in Iberia was crushed, officially liquidated after perhaps 2,000 years of presence there. However, Jewish practice did not die in Spain, or it didn't die in Portugal, it didn't die in the territories. And from now on, after today, we'll talk about that journey, the journey of the hidden Judaism or the crypto-Judaism in Iberia and its territories. So this is the end of the official Jewish presence in Spain, but next week we'll be talking about starting the journey of the crypto-Jews. Now, before we conclude the talk today, I understand I have gone over time. I'm sorry about that. But I do want to give us a challenge for all believers. So whatever the intentions of the church, we should understand that God's name was taken in vain and defiled by the events of the Inquisition. So the church's reputation was forever destroyed by this. Like hundreds of years later, we are still remembering the church for the Inquisition. And there's so many articles on the internet which say how evil the church is because they allowed Inquisitions to happen. So whatever the intention of the church, it doesn't matter as much when you think about the damage to God's name and to the name of Jesus, which has happened because of this. And actually, many Jews think of Christians as enemies precisely because of the Inquisition and other church sanctions events like this. And this should be a lesson to all of us. Like the third commandment, to not take the Lord's name in vain, is pertinent, that whatever we do on earth, we'll go to the next slide, whatever we do on earth, whatever we bound, whatever we lose on earth, reflects God. It reflects the God that we believe in, reflects Jesus, and anything we do in his name reflects his reputation. So I want to read this verse that Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 16. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So, of course, if it's possible to give glory to God and sort of give honor to God's name by doing good, it's possible to the opposite. By doing evil in God's name, we curse God. And that's a terrible stumbling block to those who are looking to Jesus, who otherwise could be interested in Jesus as well. And God's reputation is important to him. And he actually even relents on punishing people who deserve punishment for the sake of his name. In Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 22, it says, "But I withdrew my hand and acted for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations in whose sight I have brought them out." So again, God cares about his reputation, and we should care about God's reputation. And I think the lesson that we can learn from how the church reacted here was that no matter what we are trying to do, how God's name is portrayed is very important. And it is a stumbling block to people for not taking this carefully.